You are listening to Our Urban Voices with Dr. Alphonse Javed, a podcast that presents Christian narratives through diverse voices that impact urban ministry. Here is your host.
In this podcast, we cover everything from churches and church planting efforts, mission and missions organization evangelism, and unreached people groups, emerging movements and initiatives, justice, current events related to faith, and the persecuted church, to author interviews, and more. Let's get to it. Hello, and welcome back to a special edition of our Urban Voices. As an extension of the Heart for Muslims conference, all of this month's episodes explore the 2022 conference theme, The Power of Proximity, how your location, culture, and shared experience can bring Christ to Muslims. I'm your host, Dr. Alphonse Javed. Today, I'm joined by Steve Moses, Director of Shalom Medics, a project of Blazing Trees, and a Master Facilitator with the Trauma Healing Institute. He's also a consultant with Vision 5-9 Medina Focus. We're going to be talking about this Vision 5-9 Medina Focus in a minute. But our topic today focuses on the importance of addressing and working to heal trauma in the lives of refugees and immigrants, especially Muslims. And that's why I think it's important for us to talk about it. Steve has worked with and lived among Muslims primarily from Northern Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia for 26 years. So he has a lot of credentials and experience over the past 14 years. His focus has been among refugees and immigrants within the U.S., and he was formerly the director of World Relief in Memphis, a refugee resettlement agency. So let's talk to him. So welcome, Steve. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to discussing this with you today.
Yeah, so I'm very interested in this project of Blazing Trees, Vision 5-9 Medina Focus. I'm very interested in those things, and I think our listeners are too. But let's start with a little bit about our lives. I think it's important for people to know that you are human, I'm human, we have families, and from there we will launch into conversation about ministry. So share a little bit about your family, brother.
Yeah, I agree with you that we are all human. My wife and I live in Nashville, Tennessee. We've been married about 10 years, and we have a 7-year-old son and a 5-year-old daughter. And so we've been here for a few years now. So that's a little bit about us and who our family is.
And about me, just my audience already knows that, but I have 4 children, 5, 3, and my twin girls are a year and a half old, and my boys are 5 and 3, as I said, they're boys, so boys and girls. So I love my family, and when I hear about other families, it's just so neat to connect those two things, ministry and family, is how they go together, and yet God blesses that combination. And that's why I thought it's important to just talk about family a little bit. So let's start off with a little more about you, but this time I want to hear about your ministry. You've been working in Muslim ministry for many, many, many years, but can you tell us a little about your journey to specializing in trauma care?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when I started, I used to live in the Middle East. And when I came back to the States, I started working with refugees. And in that, people started asking me, well, how are you caring for their mental, their emotional, their psychological well-being? And I actually said, I'm really not. The organization that I was with, and even the refugee resettlement, just the way it was set up, wasn't designed for that. It didn't really check a box to get into that. And people came to me and said, well, you need to think about that. And really what sparked with me was me and my wife were visiting Jordan. And in that, we were visiting Syrians. And we were meeting with the family and sitting there and round up the little, camp stove there and listen to their stories, and people wanted me to hear about their lives. And they said, we're so excited. We're about to be resettled to the United States, and we're going to move to California. And I remember thinking, that's wonderful. And they said, well, our daughter, who is 4 at the time, we think she has trauma. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And they said, well, she takes a cold shower and she doesn't respond to it. And I said, well, maybe that doesn't mean she necessarily has trauma. And then they went on to say, well, she actually will grab glass and break her hand and start bleeding and shows no emotion.
Oh my God.
And,
okay. So she was cutting. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, she was cutting herself, maybe accidentally, maybe on purpose. I'm not sure, but he's as a 4-year-old. Okay. But then they also said, hey, our uncle, he is in this room with us too. He, for the past 2 years, hasn't spoken to anyone. Since this happened here in Syria, this was a few years back, as you can imagine. And he hasn't spoken to anyone, and he doesn't talk. And he used to be a hardworking man, and he was so active, but he says he wants to come talk to us today. And they said, but here's the thing that really bothered me the most in this, is they said, when we get to America, when we get to the United States, when we get to California, everything's going to be so much better. And in my mind, I looked at my wife, and we knew that wasn't necessarily true. And I came back to Tennessee, and I told my staff, I said, we're not ready for this. If they were to come to our city, we're not ready for this. We've got to be better prepared. And we better be praying for the people in California that they're prepared better than we are. So that's how I got started.
Man, it reminds me, actually, it's so interesting because, I didn't come here everybody comes here with a hope that there's going to be better life waiting for us, right? But I was sharing, I don't know which episode, but recently I shared in that episode that even in my own church, person walks in, it was Christmas Eve service, actually. So we meet in the restroom, men's room. So I am there. So he is already there. So he sees me, and passing by, he leaves this comment behind. Oh man, you never know how people can just walk in and they pretend they are Christian, and then you find out they're just going to blow up the building and all that. And he just leaves the room. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I was like, there is nobody in this restroom. I'm the only one. And I'm sure of course, it was a visitor. He didn't even know that I'm the pastor, that I'm Pakistani. So I had that memory, and that's most recent. But my earlier memories are when I got here, I went to Bible college upstate New York, and the guys I will just walk around in the dormitory. So they will make jokes to them. That was, funny thing to say, oh, watch out. He's going to blow up something. I was like, why are you saying this? And I was coming from Pakistani Christian background. So Pakistani Christians are very persecuted people. And I was like, it took me a very long time to even talk about this and say how it makes me feel. My own colleagues will make those kind of comments in my previous jobs. So things like this. So I totally understand what you're saying. So that's like you talking about the real stuff that they're dealing with. And I'm just talking about like being in upstate New York somewhere, or even in the city and New York City, all where these kind of things, and it was not even that deeper, but yet it continued to bother me and hurt me. And it takes so much time to process. And I've been here for 18, 19 years now. And thinking about a family who just finally got the news that they're going to get out and they're going to find this paradise where there is no pain, there is no crying, nothing, nobody bothers you. And then you find out, well, you are wearing a different skin, you're coming from a different country. Things are going to be different. But let me ask you this. How do you define the word trauma in your context? Let me hear that. Because mine is very different, as I shared with you. But what is your definition?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to note that people often say that trauma is perhaps the greatest mission field of the 21st century, and just things that you and I are talking about right now, right? So your perspective, and then what I even shared. So understanding that it does affect many, many people, and it doesn't play favorites. And we tell people that often. But a definition, a couple ways of looking at it, I would say it's a lasting experience that happens when we're overwhelmed by something. Okay, so it's a lasting experience that happens when we're overwhelmed by something. Or another way of saying it that Dr. Jim Wilder defines it this way: from the brain's perspective, trauma happens anytime we suffer alone. So suffering turns to trauma when we're unable to process our suffering with God and with other people. So thinking about it in that way. So, and at the basic level, trust has been broken between humans and or God with trauma. And so trauma happens in relationship. And so I firmly believe that healing needs to happen in relationship.
Yeah. And I think that I think I might be the living example of both. I'm still processing after 18, 19 years and of being here and dealing with those comments that came with my identity as Pakistani, not as Christian. But then also dealing with my identity as Christian, but not Pakistani in Pakistan. So I had like those two sets of things. And if you're talking about Iraqi, Syrian, Christian, it's same. I think they would have the same problem because the person who is seeing me here, not seeing a Christian, he's seeing a Pakistani, or seeing me, not seeing a Christian or persecuted believer, seeing me as a Arab or Middle Eastern. So all of this, so I totally see that. And in the community, only in the community I find, like even just talking to you, hearing that there is a ministry out there with this kind of focus, that Steve and his team is working on these kind of issues and educating the church and preparing the church is itself is a process of healing for me that, hey, hopefully 10 years from now, 20 years from now, if another Alphonse lands in this country, he may not go through the same thing that I went through. So I appreciate your ministry on that end too. So what are some of the different types of traumas or different types of trauma, that can affect different groups of refugees and immigrants? And without being too graphic, can you help us or give us our audience some examples of your ministry?
Yeah. Well, one, even as you're talking, I'm thinking, that most humans have some kind of trauma. We know that 70% of adults in the U.S. have experienced some type of trauma in their lifetime, right? At least once in their life. We know that. But when you talk about refugees and immigrants, we know that 39% of refugees have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, versus the general population. So we see that there's already an increase with that. So when you think about refugees in a broader sense, you already tied into some of this, but refugees have lost place. So they come here and we give them a space, we give them housing, and we think, okay, they have a space, but they've lost place. Refugees have been forcibly displaced, and so they've lost that. That's a trauma. But then you already tied into some things I was thinking about already: identity loss, status loss, honor loss, dignity loss. Those are all traumas that we don't necessarily think of as being trauma, but it is. And so then I think about even recently I was sitting with a group of women and doing a group session with them. They all came from East Africa, and they came from a Muslim background, but now are all followers of the way of Jesus. And one by one, as they were sharing, once again, in group, they were sharing for the first time some things with one another that they've never voiced to really anyone the way they were talking. And what we realized in that moment, they realized they had all experienced some of the same physical and sexual abuse. And they said, I don't know of a woman that hasn't experienced some of these things. They couldn't name one woman in their whole culture. And then they went on to say that they didn't know of any man in their life. This is telling to me. They didn't know of any man in their life, a brother, a father, even an uncle, or anyone that they can think of a male figure that had treated them kindly, right? This is a group of women saying this. I thought, there's a lot happening in that right there, that just alone. And then the last thing that I think about is most recently, with our Afghan friends that have been coming to the United States. I've been receiving more calls even more recently. So when they first started arriving to the United States, I got a lot of calls and people calling and asking different things. And then it kind of settled down. And then now more recently, it's been 8 months or so, some of them will come. I've been getting more calls and saying, hey, this person was fine 6-8 months ago, but they seem to stop wanting to go to their job. They're sitting in the corner not talking anymore. They don't see them as whatever. And I think we need to understand that's what we're really talking about there is complex trauma. And that people, now that they feel that they're a little safer, they have a time to kind of collapse and breathe. And maybe while they were getting here and traveling and getting here and surviving for their life, they were kind of staying ahead of that trauma a little bit. So now when they have time to just exhale, right? We see some of that regression, and many of us, right, don't understand that. They're like, wait a second, they have a house or a place to live, at least, an apartment. We've given them a job. They have food. They're in a, quote, safe place. Why are they, quote, acting this way, right? And I think sometimes we need to realize that it's that ongoing trauma that we're dealing with. So all those things, there's several things I just said, are some examples that we're seeing with refugees and immigrants.
And I'm sorry for keep
you don't need to be
bringing
sorry.
you back
No,
to
I know.
my
I love
own
it.
life story and reflection, because you see, I don't think about these things anymore. But because your conversation is just kind of like bringing those memories back, and this conversation itself, and I hope those who are listening, they are feeling those, because many of them are human.
Yes, yeah,
So
they're
if
all
you
human. Yeah.
if you are a human, you have trauma in your life, as you already said that, right? All of human have some sort of trauma, some kind of trauma. So hopefully this will help them to just kind of like dig deeper. But as you're talking, and I think that's what's happening to me, I'm just remembering things as you're speaking, because when I landed, my first 3-4 years were just to kind of like get through the college life, and just like, okay, how to get used to using this restroom, or how to not miss my family back home, or how to be able to provide for myself. So your initial stage, I was completely on initial stage of I don't know, survival. I was just like, okay, how to survive. I didn't have time to reflect on what I'm coming from. I'm just looking at what I have come to, how to transport my being, or how I dealt and survived there. Now I need to do the same thing somehow, but in a modern way here. So I'm just thinking as you're talking. So I think probably that's why it took me about, I don't know, like it's few years before I opened up to my wife even. And I told her some of the things, and she was like, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Simple things like, when I finally I was able to, go to school and get education. So I was just crazy for this degree and that degree and this and that schooling. And my wife was like, you need to stop this. Why you are like this? So one day we sat down and I told her why. And when she found out the real reason, that the reason I'm hungry for this, because I lacked that opportunity. I didn't have that. So there's a lot of these kind of like subtle things that are popping up as the time passes. I grow older and things are settling, and those memories are coming. And talking to you, I'm just thinking about some of these things. So probably
That makes
that's
total
why.
sense. Really, it does.
Yeah.
It makes total sense.
Yeah. So I thank you, man. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, I'm glad we're
So,
talking about it.
so when someone contacts you with someone struggling with trauma, what does the healing process look like? How do you guide them? Do you openly approach it from a Christian perspective? What do you do? I mean, I'm talking to you. So what are you going to do with me? What's your approach?
Right. Well, if we were to, pause for a second, and I would say to you, hey, let's breathe. And I think that's really important. And we have to learn to quiet ourselves and calm ourselves. I really mean that. And so a lot of that, I tell people, let's learn how to breathe and calm ourselves, because we know that being able to quiet ourselves is one of the key indicators for emotional health. We know that. So it's learning how to breathe and calm. And so part of that, even with I mentioned I have a 5 and 7-year-old, I teach them how to breathe because they get worked up, right? You have children, you mentioned, they get worked up. So I tell them, imagine you have a cup of, coffee or tea in front of you, or maybe you have a bowl of some kind of soup, and you want to breathe in with your nose, the smell of it. So that's important. You're breathing in. So, and then we'd say, then my daughter would say, "Oh, Dad, it's too hot." And I'd say, "Well, remember, blow it out, blow on that coffee and blow on that tea or blow on that soup," and doing that over and over again, breathing in with your nose and out with your mouth. So let's calm ourselves before we start talking about the trauma, right?
Right.
And so, but when someone else, a lot of people come and say, "We want to help Muslims, refugees, we want to help people that are experiencing trauma." And the first thing I'll say to them is, "Well, you need to take the journey before you lead the tour." And what I mean by that is you can't discount your own pain without trying to help someone else. And there's a quote that I use often. It says, "Discounting your own pain is a sure sign that you cannot be a reverent witness to the pain of others."
Very good.
I'll say that again. Discounting our own pain is a sure sign that you cannot be a reverent witness to the pain of others. And so that's part of where we start, is like, let's talk about that. So then if I was talking to someone like yourself or others, I would say, let's talk about how do we actually listen to you well. So we teach a lot of listening skills. People think that talking less is good listening. That's not necessarily good listening. So another quote that's often shared is, "Being heard is so close to being loved that the average person, it's indistinguishable." Right? So just someone being able to share their story in a safe context that feels that they can share that. Because once again, trauma, some trust has been broken. Can I actually share this with this person? Do I feel comfortable sharing this person? So I teach people about how to listen well, and we can talk more about that. But then the other thing is, we often talk about how you need to raise levels of joy. So the joy by definition, the way I define it is that I'm glad to be with someone, right? That someone's glad to be with me, that kind of thing. I'm glad that person is glad to be with me. So if I'm giving you the ministry of presence, I'm enjoying my time with you. And then we talk about because joy is contagious, joy is relational, joy is something our brains desire more than anything else. So how do we raise joy before we even talk about trauma? So I do that so much. So when we're doing that, and then the other thing is, we do this usually in group context. I already referenced that a little bit, because people need to share their trauma, because trauma disconnects people. But also we want them to be able to tell their stories, and other people can hear that story and say, "Oh, I'm not alone. Someone else has that same story." Just as I shared with those women from East Africa, they started saying, "Oh my goodness, you feel the same way I do. I didn't know that happened to anyone else." And then also, trauma affects our whole body. So we want to do it in a way that we're approaching our mind, our emotions, and our body, which are all necessary for the healing process. And then as far as, I help people from any faith background, and I do use God's word or the Injil or the holy books, whatever way we would need to frame it for the context we're in. And I tell people, we're going to use that. And people say, "How does that happen?" I said, well, when people are really hurting, I've even had leaders of mosques that I've talked with, and they said, I want help. And I said, well, I'm going to use the Injil. And they'd say, "That's okay." Because you're just offering it to them, and it's not a bait and switch. It's not, "Hey, come talk about your trauma and your pain, and now I want to tell you about Jesus." It's like, I'm going to tell you that we're going to come share our stories, we're going to listen to one another, and then also we're going to use this because we know that ultimately Jesus is the healer.
Amen. So what role Islam plays? Because your context,
Yes.
I'm hearing it's a lot of Muslim folks. So what role does Islam play in the lives of Muslim working through trauma?
Yeah. Well, I'll probably quote some of our friends that come from a Muslim background and what they've told me. And so, one, I believe that Islam has little to offer in terms of healing from trauma and loss. So I'll say that there's not much that they offer when it comes to the actual healing process, which I think is why this imam was interested in what I was talking about. I think another thing that a Central Asian brother told me is, like, the reason he got involved in trauma care is, he said, Islam doesn't offer any hope. There's no way out. There's nothing there. So thinking about that, and that there's no place to really place what they're dealing with, right? And then there's no category for that. And I think one of the big things that we see with Islam playing in the lives of trauma with Muslims is actually fear and fear bonds. And what I mean by that is we're either bonding with people out of love or out of fear. And often the approach is that their God is not known as a God of love. Our God is known as love, period. Like he's love, not just loving, he is love. And so I think that plays a role into it of fear, which then leads to what I'm sure you've talked about many times, leads to shame and leads to the things about, how do we have honor? So I think all those things play into how trauma can affect our Muslim friends.
Yeah. And I love the way you are very upfront and honest about, hey, I am, yes, this service is available, but it is in the love of Jesus Christ. But at the same time, you're very clear that how is it's different from any religion for that
Yes.
matter, because in every religion you're gonna find religious teachings to care for the soul, and nobody thinks about like, yes, you are the soul. This body is temporary, but still it's yours.
Mm-hmm.
And it hurts, and all of that is part of that. Actually, it reminds me, I'm going through this series here at our church, Colossians, and the whole heretical viewpoint in there was, don't worry about the body's going to die one day, so
Yes.
just worry about your soul, and then give your body over to sin, so keep sinning. And I think it's the perpetrator and the victim both, when they have that kind of mentality, because the religion doesn't suggest otherwise, then there's a problem. So Muslims are frequently stereotyped. What is something commonly assumed about Muslims that you would like to dispel in this conversation?
Yeah, I really like this question, and it made me ponder. And I think one of the things that you've already touched on a little bit when you talked about some of the things that you experienced, I like for people to understand that all Muslims don't have ill intent. That Muslims are actually fun. They love to laugh, they love to dance, and entertain, and host. They're kind. They're family oriented. That they really are human, right? And so, and they just aren't out to just harm people all the time. Kind of like the comments you had in that bathroom, that terrible experience you had. That's just a broad stereotype that all Muslims want to cause harm in some way. And I'm thinking, no, they're actually fun-loving. So many of the ones that I know for sure.
Yeah, and I think I also like that you're very specific, and you don't give 30 different answers. You just like give me like, hey, let's let people focus on one thing. And I like that. And I think you're doing this intentionally, and I think it's helpful. Just that one thing. So let it be. Whoever is hearing this, know that not all Muslims are the same. I mean, they're simply not. And they are human, and most of them, they just want to get to know you. They want to enjoy the American life. They want to enjoy freedom. And stereotyping is just something only going to divide us further, right? So what tangible steps can listeners take if they are motivated to start assisting refugees with trauma healing in their own neighborhoods and or even church? Like, for example, my church, I'm surrounded by many Muslim communities. I mean, Arabs and Middle Easterns, Bengalis, Pakistanis, Indian Muslims even. So there are all kind of Muslims here too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the first thing that we usually teach is do no harm. There's a lot of well-intended people that want to help with trauma, but they can still cause trauma. They don't know that, but because they're not aware of that, so they can. So I think that's one. So do no harm. And what I mean by that is, okay, let's be present with them. So let's go back to that joy piece that I'm glad to be with them. Really be glad to be with them. Be present with them. Sit with them. Even, be calm with them, teaching them to even breathe and relax and be there. And I think a key thing is actually listening well to them. And so people often say, well, I think I'm a good listener. And I'd say, well, that can be true and maybe it's not, but we're teaching people how to listen well, So one of the things with that about listening well is just being present, and then thinking about how to not fix or solve them or give them theological answers, right? And so part of that is we are meaning makers. You and I and all humans are meaning makers. So we want to try to figure out, why did that happen to X, Y, or Z person? And we're going to try to give them something. But we really want them to tell their story and discover what's going on, versus us just telling them things and giving them solutions that may or may not work. So in a trusted relationship, if you know this person, right, you've built that relationship, don't just walk up to someone on the street and start asking these questions I'm about to share with you. But in that context of relationship, while you're having tea or having over for a meal, you can say, tell me what happened. And you may know what happened, but let them frame it for you. Let them tell it in their words, their way, their context. And then saying, man, thank you so much for sharing that with me. So how did you feel? Let them, healing happens on the emotional level. Let them name some of those emotions. And then another good question to ask people is, what was the hardest part for you? And those last two words are important, for you, because you and your wife, or me and my wife, or me and my family can go through the same exact experience, but we're going to experience it differently. Not every Afghan that came to the United States experienced the same thing. So ask them, what was the hardest part for you? So let them tell their story, and let them feel safe doing that. So, do no harm, be present, helping them breathe, really enjoy being with them. Let them know that you actually enjoy being with them. I can't say that enough. You're not just trying to move on. You're not trying to just, quote, heal them, right? You enjoy being with them, and then ask them those questions with those things.
Very relational, man. That's extremely relational.
Yes,
that's
it
a
is.
commitment.
Yeah. Yes.
I think that's how, as I'm hearing you, that's how I'm processing in my mind what it means. And I think it seems like a genuine relationship right there.
We started off this whole thing with that. We want to treat people as human. We want people to know that you and I are human, but also Muslims are human. And then sitting with them and enjoying time with them. And then really what we're trying to help people is just to be good friends to people as well. So I want to be this way with you, and I want to be this way with people that are Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever, Christian, whatever background they are. I think that's what we're called to be as people of the kingdom.
Yeah. And I tell you this, when we treat, I was having this conversation with another guest on the podcast, and he said that most immigrant Muslims or immigrants in general, even if they are just, doing mundane things, for example, maybe selling strawberries or something on the side of, on the roadside, they have a lot of influence back home. And when we treat, I'm just thinking, connecting that with this conversation, that when we treat them good here, when we are doing what you just said, being human, I think their influence can have a ripple effect over there. So perhaps somebody who is, not Muslim and being persecuted because of the experience they have here may change the idea over there back home. So I'm just thinking missionally,
I love that.
globally.
I think it's the whole thing about hospitality, right? Yeah. So we know that it's such an honor to go into someone's house when we are traveling in a Muslim world, but then how many don't come into an American home, right? Don't visit that. So they tell those stories, right? And so they tell those things back and forth. I think it's so true. So true.
Anything else you want to add before we start wrapping this up, brother?
I think it's I would say the only thing I would add probably is, don't let fear drive you, right? Don't let fear drive you. Go ahead and go talk to that neighbor, go talk to that friend, go talk to that person, that shopkeeper, right? And engage with them. Don't let fear drive us.
That's awesome. Good advice. If listeners wants to get in touch with you, Steve, what are the easiest ways?
Yeah, if you're thinking, man, I want to know more about this, or I want to be trained myself, we offer trainings all the time. You can email me at steve.moses@vision59.com. So that's steve.moses@vision and the number 59.com. Or you can go to blazingtrees.org. So blazingtrees.org, you'll see what we're doing there as well.
Great. That will also be included in the episode description. And for the last thing, because we started with this human aspect of us sharing about our lives, I also want to make sure that in the middle of serious conversation, the type of things we're talking about, trauma, there is nothing more serious than trauma, right? I want to make sure that we leave with a less serious, dramatic thing. So tell me a joke, lighten the mood.
Yeah, I got a joke for you. This is from my 7-year-old son. Okay. So you're going to help me with this, though. So it's a knock-knock joke. So knock, knock.
Who's there?
Cows.
Cows who?
No cows moo. Owls who? So there you go.
This is better. I've heard the other ones like moo ones where that you're trying to speak and they're like moo.
No, see, my son turned it around on us, didn't he? Yeah. So
this is nice. Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here on the show. Again, that was Steve from Blazing Trees. And thank you to all our listeners. If you appreciate this podcast, please be sure to subscribe to the show and leave an honest review wherever you listen to your podcast. Turn in next week for more honest discussions from diverse voices.
You've been listening to Our Urban Voices with Dr. Alphonse Javed, which presents Christian narratives through diverse voices that impact urban ministry. Please check back for new episodes every week.